Hi, I'm Jim Beckman, and I want to take some time to talk about a couple of very important topics. I'm going to do two quick sessions here, one on what I'm calling the changing face of teenagers, and then I want to look at the changing face of youth ministry. As I kind of dig into these two topics, I think they become, in some ways, the fallow ground that we need to be in as we're looking at how do we more effectively disciple young people today, and how do we do more effective youth ministry with them. So I'm going to jump right in with these sessions and really ask for the Lord's guidance and direction for us all. Why don't we start with a quick prayer? In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, we are so grateful for your many rich blessings and for all the ways that you love us, care for us, provide for us. And Lord, I pray, especially for those of us who are ministers to young people, that you would open our hearts and open our minds to all that you would want to show us and reveal to us about how we could be more effective in making disciples of you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, let's start by just looking at generations, because I think one of the important things we have to do is really understand the generational shifts that have happened with young people in our time. There's a very popular, probably one of the leading sociologists that really talk about this would be Howe and Strauss. They have a number of books out on generations and particularly their information on millennials. This is how they would break down the generations. We have the lost generation, 1883 to 1900, the GI, or the Great Generation, in the early 1900s, followed by the silent generation up to 1942, the baby boomers, and then we really start to get into this period of history that's kind of more familiar to us. In the early 60s, Gen X, and then in the early 80s, the emergence of Gen Y, which we now commonly refer to as millennials. The reason why they're called millennials is because many of them were graduating from high school right around the turn of the millennium, around the year 2000. And then we have what people are beginning to call Gen Z right now. I think that title's kind of given XYZ. There's lots of other names that are being kind of touted around, but I think it's too early yet for one to have set in. Like in some ways, the Gen Y title was one that was never really fully embraced by sociologists, but definitely by the generation themselves. And that's where the term millennials really stuck with them. And so I think most people refer to the millennials now instead of Gen Y. But Gen Z, this new generation, I've heard terms like the I generation or the internet generation, the technology generation. Some of those terms, like I said, they haven't really landed on one. But for the sake of this conversation, I'm actually going to look at the millennials. And the reason why is because Gen Z is so new that we don't have a whole lot of information about it. There have been some studies and some research that I can point to, but everything that we're seeing right now is that modern teenagers are almost an extreme version of millennials. So you can take a lot of the characteristics and the qualities of the millennial generation, and you can apply it, but just go even further with today's teenagers. So let's look at this. The millennial generation, lots of characteristics, lots of things about them. Let me pull up a list here of what I would say are some of the key characteristics, and some of them may be surprising to you. They're upbeat and positive. I would say one of the key characteristics of millennials is they're very optimistic. They're very engaged. They want to be engaged. They're rule followers, almost conformist. And you got to think like their whole lifetime, they have been really surrounded by lots of rules from the first days that they were born in the early 80s. We started having all kinds of rules and laws coming into place for their safety, right? We started with car seats and baby on board signs, and then as this group kind of came into elementary school, we were changing out the playground equipment and coming up with new rules and new protocol about how people had to come into the buildings. And I mean, this group has had lots of rules that have been put around them to protect them, and it's one of the reasons why they actually are very comfortable with that kind of structure. They're technologically advanced. In some ways, the millennial generation, Gen Z even more so, but the millennial generation is marked by technology. Rapid changes and shifts in technology, right? They're more culturally diverse. Much higher percentages in both the millennial generation and now Gen Z of cultural diversity. Shifting spending habits. High spending on entertainment, on beauty products, health and beauty products. They say that the teen generation has the highest percentage of disposable income of any other age demographic in society. Wow. And you know that they're getting that disposable income not from their jobs, because a lot of them don't have jobs. They're getting that disposable income from their parents. But it's interesting that that age demographic has such a high level of disposable income. They're highly organized. So we call them the organization kids, right? Like they form groups, and they form clubs, and they work together. They're very collaborative. They're very group-oriented. Busy 24/7, highly motivated to service and community projects. Many of you may have noticed a shift where you do things like a service project or a mission trip. And you actually have a lot of kids who have never been involved in the youth ministry really interested in those kinds of activities. Not so much because they've had a conversion experience and they're kind of flowing out of that conversion and wanting to do mission. They're just attracted to it because their generation is attracted to those kinds of things. Edgy retro styles, digital IT, information and technology revolution, transform their high schools. I would say transformed their grade schools, their preschools, then their grade schools, then their middle schools, then their high schools, then their colleges. And what we're seeing now, in almost a scary way, is they're literally transforming the workplace. A lot of millennials are in their late 20s, some even in their early 30s. If you go all the way back to the early 80s as the beginning of this generation, many of them coming into the workforce, there's Fortune 500 companies that are literally changing their protocol about how they hire employees to allow parents to be a part of the interview process. Now, you may have problems with that and think that that's ridiculous, but it's happening. We've got these large companies that have had to deal with parents who are hounding them, wanting information as their child, their late 20s, early 30-year-old child is trying to get a job. And the companies have caved in and have actually allowed the parents to actually come and be a part of the whole interview and hiring process. So this is the dramatic shift that we've seen. There's a huge change from, particularly if we go back to that the list of the generations, from Gen X to Gen Y or millennials. There was this huge generational shift, and I think a lot of it was really driven by the rapid changes in technology and media and entertainment. We have, I think, a kind of a perfect storm, which I'm going to explain here in a few minutes. Let's look at the core traits. So Howe and Strauss are these, very, very popular, accomplished sociologists. This is what they've identified as the core traits of millennials. Now, I know you may be thinking like I'm in the wrong age group talking about millennials. Many of them are in their young adult years now. But remember, the traits of the millennials are actually present in Gen Z, but to extreme measures, right? So special, entitled. When you've grown up your whole life and everything has changed and shifted to accommodate you, which is what millennials experienced as they grew up. The playgrounds changed, the laws changed, the school environments changed. Everything changed to accommodate them. When you've experienced that your whole life, you actually come to a place in your life where you start to expect it. And it's not because you're spoiled. The whole sense of entitlement that we see in the millennial generation was conditioned in them. It's not something they chose. It's actually something that happened to them because of all of the cultural shifts that were going on in our society, right? So this entitlement is typically talked about like this is this really negative thing, right? They call them the entitlement generation. But the reality is they didn't pick that. They didn't choose to be entitled. That was what was conditioned in them, right? Sheltered. Elbow pads and knee pads and helmets and, like everything around these kids as they've grown up was trying to protect them from being injured or being hurt. In some ways, sheltered isn't strong enough. Maybe coddled would be a better word, right? Like they've had so much stuff. It's almost like they were bubble wrapped going through life, trying to protect them. So very, very sheltered. They're very confident, almost overconfident, right? But that confidence isn't rooted in something that's very deep, right? So once they start to experience opposition or if somebody comes against them, that confidence can actually be shattered pretty quickly. But they carry themselves in a way that's very, very confident, almost overly confident. Very team-oriented. In some ways, many people call them the Power Ranger generation. They grew up with all of these cartoons and all of these stories, these narratives around them that were all kind of based on we're more powerful together than any one of us are as an individual, right? And so that's become a big part of their paradigm and the way they approach life. Very conventional. We talked about rule followers and how so many laws and so many things came into effect for this group as they were growing up that they became very conventional, almost conformist. They're highly pressured. So they have lots of pressure. They're high achievers. And a lot of that is because they've been told their whole life, you're going to change the world. You're so special. You can do anything, right? I mean, I typically start out the semester with my classes here at the Augustine Institute because I have a lot of millennials that I end up teaching here. And I will typically start at the beginning of the semester talking to the students about how you're not special. You're not going to change the world by yourself. The only thing that makes you special is that you're a child of God. And that with God's Spirit in you and God's life in you, God has a plan for your life that He's going to fulfill and going to carry out. And it's an amazing plan because it's God's plan, right? But by yourself on your own, you're just not that special, right? And I know that's a hard thing to hear. It maybe sounds harsh to say it. But there's a reality that so many young people actually breathe a sigh of relief when somebody finally tells them that. They've had so many people for their whole life that's been telling them that they're going to change the world. Well, man alive, that's a lot of pressure. I have to change the world, right? So there's almost a way that I think an approach to parenting in a lot of ways has backfired, right? We have huge percentages of young adults that are graduating from college and are going home to live with their parents. They're literally paralyzed and can't get jobs because they feel so much pressure to succeed and be over the top and off the charts with their success that many of them are paralyzed and can't even get off of ground zero, right? So it's easier to just live at home in my parents' basement and play video games, right? So these are some of the characteristics of millennials. I want to introduce you to maybe a new concept. This has been around for a while. There is another sociologist, Dr. Tim Elmore, who wrote a book called Gen IY. And he's basically asking the question, a typical generation span is about 20 years, right? So you would have, for millennials, the typical breakdown would be the early 80s into the early 2000s. So we would have a 20-year span. Now, this is birth, the year of people's birth, right? So the beginning of the millennial generation were children being born in the early 80s. Tim Elmore is asking the question, is there a new generation that actually splits the millennials in half? He has done tons of training with young people, high school students all over the country. He does training for Chick-fil-A, for Sears, I think for JCPenney's. So he has lots of teen employees that he coordinates through training programs. And in the context of that work that he did early on in his career, he started identifying huge differences between the first half of Gen Y or millennials and the latter half. And he's asking the question, is it possible that there's actually two different generations here because they're so dramatically different? Here's how he would break it down. You have Howe and Strauss's definition that we looked at earlier, right? And they go millennials 1982 to the early 2000s. But here's how Tim Elmore would break that down and configure it. He actually breaks this generation into two. We have the early part of the millennials, early 80s to early 90s. But in the early 90s, say 1992, was really the beginning of the latter half of millennials that we're going to call Gen IY. Now this is getting closer, I think, to the characteristics of the teens that we're working with today, which we're going to call Gen Z for our purposes today. Here's what we would say about Gen IY. They reflect their earlier Gen Y counterparts in many ways. Yet in volumes of ways, they stand in stark contrast. They were impacted far more by the technology of their generation than the early part. Tangible impact of the I world. Internet, iPods, iTunes, iPhones, iPads, iChat, iMovie, right? And in some ways you could say that this whole generation, everything about them is I. It's a very, very me-centered, a very narcissistic type of existence that teenagers grow in. Everything revolves around them. They literally have grown up online, and I think you can say that even more so for Gen Z. Like their entire paradigm is immediate access to information through the internet, right? What kind of impact does this have when a generation is literally defined by technology? So meet Gen IY. Here's what Tim Elmore says would be the 4 key characteristics that describe them. They're overwhelmed. Remember the characteristic of the millennials? Highly pressured, very high achievers. I think it's even more extreme with Gen IY and Gen Z. So they're overwhelmed and stressed out, and they're involved in so many things. Parents who literally are signing them up for every possible activity to try and round out their resume, right? They're over-connected. They're connected almost 24/7. Connected through social media, connected through their phones. Many young people today, if they had to choose to give up their phone or give up television, would give up television immediately. It wouldn't even be a struggle in that choice. Many young people would consider their smartphone to be an appendage to their body. Like that's how fused they are to technology, right? So this has big impact on, I think, our understanding of teenagers today. They're overprotected. We talked about the whole sheltered aspect of millennials and how that bleeds now into Gen IY. They're overprotected. We've almost done too much to try and protect them from any of the harshness of life, from being physically injured to being emotionally hurt. We constantly try to protect them. And you've got lots and lots of parents who are more kind of the overprotective helicopter type parents that have done that to extreme degrees, right? And finally, they're overserved. And this is the whole sense of entitlement that I think happens with these younger generations that we experience. So these are Tim Elmore's kind of characteristics, right? So as we look at all of that, I just want us to understand the seismic shifts that have happened for this generation. And now we have these teenagers that we are working with today that have gone through these kinds of experiences, right? They've had a huge change in music delivery. The music that they listen to, previous generations, you had to go buy an album or buy a disc, a CD. The music wasn't in an electronic format. It wasn't all of my music at my fingertips in an electronic device that I could put in my pocket, right? Like the whole music delivery system just radically transformed, right? Television viewing, huge changes in the way television is viewed. Massive amounts of programming available to you so that you can literally pick whatever you want at any time that you want it. You know, kind of that whole on-demand type of approach. Phone calls to text messages. There's not a lot of communication happening, real, authentic communication. Definitely not communication that leads somebody to an experience of intimacy, right? Social networking, which gives a feeling of, kind of felt intimacy, but it's not real, it's not authentic, and so it doesn't really meet some of the deeper human needs that young people have. Personal updating, right? These have been like seismic shifts. We've got like tectonic plates shifting in the ground underneath young people that's literally changed the way that they operate, the way that they interact with people, the way they socialize, the way they form relationships and bonds. Huge changes, particularly from what we experienced when we were teenagers. So understanding young people is going to be, we're going to be uniquely handicapped to be able to do that without really getting into their world and understanding that better. What are the causes of all of this? As I kind of wind down here in this first session to understanding the changing face of teens, I want us to look at what are some of the root causes, what are some of the underpinnings of all of these cultural changes that have led us to the place that we're at today, and how can we more effectively understand teens in the midst of those cultural shifts? Here's what's going on. Frank Mercadante came out with a book in the past couple years about engaging the millennial generation, engaging modern teenagers. And he talks about these same three things. I like to think of it almost like a perfect storm. Like we have just the shift happening from modernism to postmodernism. It's like that's happening, just the generational shift. Or I'm sorry, the cultural shift, right? Like we've had a driving agenda of the modern agenda that's been going on, and it goes, like the early signs of it will go all the way back to the 11 and 1200s. Like we could do a whole nother session just tracing the kind of the historical development of postmodernism. I'm not going to get into all that, but I want us to understand that that's the landscape, right? The ground that all of this is happening in. We've got this huge change that's happening from modernism to postmodernism, and really underneath all of that is kind of a loss of a moral compass, a loss of our story, right? So like one of the driving agendas of modernism is kind of the destruction of the modern canon. So we're trying to detach ourselves from all of these historical things that actually give us bearings, because they saddle us with guilt, or they saddle us with rules, or saddle us with things, like that's kind of the modern understanding. And it gets even worse as we move into postmodernism, right? So we've got this shift going on from modernism to postmodernism, but we also have the generational shift. So we've got the generational shift happening from Gen X to Gen Y, and now from Gen Y to Gen Z, making some of these characteristics even more extreme. But at the same time, we have all of the technology, internet, that whole cultural change that's happening at the same time. I mean, this is like the perfect storm. The perfect storm is 3 storm systems that converge into one and become a huge storm that's so destructive, it's almost unrecoverable, right? And that's what we've experienced. We've experienced this huge, huge change with these 3 things kind of all converging at the same period of time in history. And what it's led to is what I would call diminished capacities, human capacities. We have a diminished capacity for reason. When you look at the whole philosophical threads of moral relativism and kind of ripping us away from like things that should be connected, right? Like law and freedom actually should be connected. But what's happened in modernism is we want to throw law out because we don't want to have any rules, and that's what makes us free, right? Like freedom has become freedom from the burden of laws and freedom from rules. That's what makes me free, right? Well, that's actually not a true definition of freedom. Freedom is meant to be free for, right? I'm free for the good is what true, authentic freedom is. But so what happens with moral relativism, what happens, like we detach reason from faith. You can't have good reason and have faith in something. So those 2 things get split apart from each other. This is what modernism does. And actually what it leads to is a diminished capacity for authentic reason. We have a diminished capacity for truth. Again, to moral relativism. 93% of modern teenagers and young adults, 93% don't believe that there is an absolute objective truth. So if you're sitting in a room with 100 kids, 93 of them could just unplug you, switch you off at any time. Well, maybe that's true for you. I mean, the landscape of this is huge. A diminished capacity for truth. There's a diminished capacity for knowledge, true knowledge, right? Because knowledge actually used to be rooted in something. Now knowledge is just information. And you see this very, very prevalently with modern teenagers, right? When you can Google things at any time and just get a quick answer. You can know a lot of information, right? Only an inch deep, and actually think that you're really, really smart. But knowledge actually is rooted into something much deeper. And so that's just information. It's not really knowledge, right? So we have a diminished capacity for this. And I really believe that one of the greatest things that we have is a diminished capacity for authentic community. Young people today don't have a capacity for intimacy. It's not something that they're really experiencing regularly in their life, even with their own families, with their own parents. And so they have this diminished capacity for intimacy. But my whole point is these capacities are human things. These are things that are fundamentally human about us. We need them. We have a hunger for them, a desire for them very deeply in the core of our being. So just because we have a diminished capacity for them, it'd be like saying, I have a diminished capacity for food. I still hunger for food. And just because I have a diminished capacity for it, maybe I'm starving, maybe my stomach's shrinking, so maybe I've got to eat it in smaller bites and smaller pieces until I can kind of nurse myself back to health. But if I don't eat, I'm going to die. And this would be my whole point. We may have a diminished capacity for reason, but as human beings, we fundamentally need to understand reason. And we need to understand how reason is connected to faith and how the two form a beautiful marriage with each other. We need to have truth. We hunger and desire truth. And when we don't have objective truth in front of us, we flail around in life directionless. We don't know where we're going. We don't know where we came from. We don't know what the point of things are. This is what we see in our modern culture. And it's the world, unfortunately, that young people are living in every day. These diminished capacities and all of these cultural shifts, I believe, have led us to a number of things that we think about kids. And whether we would admit it or not, maybe many of us, as you start to hear me list off some of these things, maybe some of you would say, I don't know if I really believe that. But I think you would agree with me that these myths are widely accepted in our modern culture. That this is kind of the general way that most adults think about young people. Number one, teens hate their parents. So kids don't like their parents. They don't want to be around their parents. And the reason why I think this is such a common myth among most adults is because that's what we felt about our parents. So again, this is a generational shift, right? The opposite is actually true. Teenagers, high percentages of teens in studies that have been done over the last 5-10 years, high percentages of teens say they like their parents, they enjoy being around their parents, and they actually wish that they could spend more time with them. So it is just fundamentally not true that teens hate their parents and don't like being around them. What about a second one? Teens want, even need, to be completely independent of adults. Now, this might have been a great understanding of young people back in the 70s, maybe into the early 80s. And this was the whole way that youth ministry emerged in the Catholic Church, but even in the Protestant evangelical world. Youth ministry became a social setting where young people could be isolated from adults, particularly their parents, but also other adults, and they could kind of form their own social community, their own social network. It's a myth. High percentages of teens say that one of their greatest desires is to have meaningful conversations with adults in their life about things that are important to them. They want to be in relationship with adults, but unfortunately so many adults don't think that kids want anything to do with them that they don't ever give any time to it. It's a myth that young people need to be completely independent of adults. If you think about it like trying to teach somebody how to ski, I think the worst thing in the world that you could ever do if you want to teach somebody how to ski is to go put them on the bunny slope. You might go to the bunny slope 1 or 2 times to help them figure out how to stand on their skis and get their bearings and get their balance, right? They're not going to learn anything about skiing on the bunny slope because nobody else on the bunny slope knows how to ski. I'm going to take them up onto a green slope or a blue slope, and I'm going to start getting them to learn how to traverse down the hill, watching me or watching other people who actually know how to ski. I wouldn't surround them with a bunch of people who don't know anything about it, right? This is what we do to teenagers, though. We create social settings where teens can hang out with all other teens who are just as lost, just as confused, and don't know what life is about, just like them. And now they're just all on the bunny slope together, kind of self-commiserating, none of them really knowing where they're going, right? Third myth, teens don't like church and are going to constantly rebel if you make them go. Teens don't like church. They don't really have a capacity for spirituality, and so they're just not going to like it. Again, not true. High percentages of teens in surveys that have been done have said that faith is very important to them. Almost 75% of them actually would claim themselves to be Christian. Now, I know that there's not tangible evidence that would show that they really understand what that means. They can't articulate what they believe. They can't articulate even the basic tenets of faith. So that Christian label doesn't go very deep. I get that. But my argument would be it doesn't go very deep for their parents. The problem isn't the kids. The problem is that kids actually would have a capacity, would have a desire for faith, but they don't have adults around them that are modeling it and pursuing it. It's a myth to say that kids don't like it, that kids don't want anything to do with it. Next myth. Teens are rebellious, and increasing numbers are into sex, violence, drugs, alcohol, etc. Again, not true. Study after study has shown conclusively that going all the way back to the millennial generation, that the percentages of young people having sex, drinking alcohol, committing violence, drugs, drinking, all of it, everything across the board, every area, percentages are down year after year after year. Many people would kind of coin the term the goody-goody generation for the millennials. And it just continues to be like that as we went into Gen IY and now into Gen Z. Young people are fundamentally better than previous generations, particularly around all of these areas of moral choices. Next myth. Teens are immature and incapable of serious relationships. Again, it's just fundamentally not true. This is a myth. I think the immaturity actually is in the adults. I hate to say this, but my observation as a youth minister is so many adults don't really want to spend any time with kids, even their own children. I mean, you got these horror stories about parents, who will just drop their kids off at church. So you got a kid who's actually really mature and really trying to pursue their faith and pursue relationships with people and trying to improve themselves. Their parents don't want anything to do with it. And so the parents will actually fight against the teen, will be all upset that they have to even take them over to the church. I had one youth minister tell me this unbelievable story. A kid going through confirmation preparation. Parents dropped them off every single time they had a session. The parents would just drop them off at church and run back home, come back and pick them up when it was over. At the end of the year, the parents dropped that kid off at the church for the confirmation ceremony and went back home. They came back and picked him up after the ceremony was over. But how scandalous is that? Like, I think adults are immature. The myth is that teens are immature. The fact is that they haven't had mature adults that have modeled what it really looks like to live a good life. Kids aren't immature. I believe it's a myth, and they are capable of serious relationships. They're capable of much more than we give them credit for. And finally, teens aren't capable of a serious faith. I think many adults believe that teens, they'll do that when they become an adult. Well, and I think there's a lot of people that actually would argue teens are just naturally, they're going to disengage, they're going to go away from the faith, but they'll come back. When they get older, when they start getting married or they start having kids, they'll return. Well, I have two fundamental, statistically proven points of data that just completely bust this myth all over the place. Number one, the vast majority of adults who are practicing their faith made a decision to do so before the age of 13. Studies have shown that those who are still practicing the faith in their adult years, they actually started on that trajectory in their teenage years, many of them before the age of 13. And secondly, I think there's very conclusive data to show, particularly with the millennial generation, if somebody leaves the faith, abandons the faith, they're not coming back. We've got enough years under our belt now of young adults who are getting married, starting careers, having children, they're not returning to their faith. If they left at some point during their young adult years, they're not coming back when those significant things happen, like getting married and having children. They're not returning. So we cannot bank. That would be another myth, that if somebody leaves and abandons the faith, they're going to return. We need to get them when they're young. So these are the myths that I think, this whole perfect storm that we find ourselves in, these are the myths that have been perpetuated in this environment. And it leaves us, I think, in a place where lots of things have happened in terms of the choices that we've made about how we're going to minister to kids. We've made lots of choices that are actually rooted, I think, in these myths. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next session.